My baby dolls, we're back again. Early June, feels like March in New England. But hey, we're in New England and, beautiful 48 degrees out there with rain and I'm sure Glenn in Vermont, he's having the same thing. But hey, we got Glenn Stout returning to the show, and this time we are in New England with Fenway 1912, the birth of a ballpark, a championship season, and Fenway's remarkable first year. And let me tell you something, folks. Even before I come on and I introduce Glenn, and then, of course, we had Glenn with the babe, this is a fantastic book, and this is coming from a Yankees fan, all right? First of all, it never dawned on me, it dawned on me, Fenway Park was put up in 1912. It was the dead ball era. All the parks were starting to come together, and stadiums were growing. You had Forbes Field in 1909. Comiskey Park was around that time, Navin Field. But I didn't know that they had a new manager. I didn't know that Smokey Joe would win 34 games. I didn't know about the building of Fenway Park, as did a lot of other people, but we're going to get into that. And we're going to have Glenn Stout on the show. But first, as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. You are listening to Genesis on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And, of course, a lot of good shows on baseball history and educating you folks with the love and passion and entertainment that, we try to do, because this stuff can get mundane. But, we got the Giants baseball. And today on the show, on the network, I'm going to be talking about Christy Mathewson with Ralph Tycho and Alan Blumpkin. He's going to be, our host here. And Alan, of course, I do the show with renowned author David Nemec. I do David Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia. I also do my show, Genesis, and I also do Oakland A's history with Ralph on occasion. So there's a lot of baseball going on, a lot of moving forward, and we are stuck in New England today, and for a good reason. Fenway 1912. If you haven't noticed, or if you didn't read about it, this book got rave reviews back when it was published for the 100th anniversary of Fenway Park. I mean, it won the Seymour Award. I can't say enough of it. Charles, what was his name? I'm forgetting. I draw blanks. What are you going to
Harold Seymour.
Yeah, that's right.
Harold and Dorothy.
Right. That's right. And, just a great book. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Glenn Stout.
Thanks very much.
Now, let me ask you something. You did research on Fenway back in 1981 when you were writing an article about it, but a lot of questions were left unanswered. Why did it take so long to get these questions together, almost 30 years later?
Well, sometimes when you do a little bit of research on something, and I did the 75th anniversary story about Fenway Park for the Red Sox yearbook, and even then I was struck by the fact that some of the most basic questions I didn't have answers to. And sometimes you do an article like that, and my expectation then was somebody else would probably jump in at some point and answer those questions. And then later I wrote Red Sox Century, which was a comprehensive history of the team. I answered a few more questions about Fenway Park, but I also ended up with more and more questions about it. And once again, I sort of thought that somebody at some point would jump in and provide those answers, and nobody really did. So, as the anniversary approached, that was an obvious hook to do a Fenway book, and I knew there would be many. And I think that at the end of the day, there was something like 15 or 18 different books that came out of that anniversary. There were some official histories. There were many illustrated histories, just a whole vast variety of books. And I thought I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to do an illustrated history. I didn't want to do a history of a place over an entire 100-year period. That's very difficult to manage. So I just kind of stepped back and said, well, what I really don't know is how Fenway Park was built. And let me just start there. And the actual genesis of the book, I'll never forget it. It was a Saturday morning. I was driving to the local transfer station, and it just struck me to write about Fenway 1912, to cover the building of the ballpark and the first year in the ballpark, because I thought that would give me the opportunity to address all elements of Fenway Park through the story of that first season. You know, when something would happen in a game in 1912, that would give me an opportunity to write about the Green Monster if the left field wall came into play. If, you know, there was a play down the right field line at the foul pole, well, that would allow me to talk about the pesky pole. And that was the plan of the book, was to discuss Fenway Park through that season and the opportunities that season gave to discuss the different elements of the ballpark.
And you know, it's interesting. I'll tell you what's interesting, Glenn. You were born out in Ohio, I think. If my
Yes.
research, what was it called, Amlin, Ohio? Now, let me ask you this question. You wanted to move to a city with an old ballpark. How come you didn't choose Cincinnati, you know, or Cleveland, for God's sake?
Well, I was also, I'd gone to school in upstate New York, and I wanted to go to a city with a classic old ballpark. And at that time, you were basically down to Chicago and Fenway, and I wanted to go somewhere where I knew people. And I had a friend in Chicago. I was going to move there, and then sort of at the last minute, I took a right, and I went to Boston instead because I knew more people there. So I had a better foothold to live in a city, and I lived within walking distance of Fenway Park for 10 years. Probably went to, 200-300 games there. For a time, I was close enough that I could hear the Star Spangled Banner, decide to go to a game, leave my apartment, and get there for the first pitch. Of course, this is when you could get into Fenway Park for $3, and you didn't have to buy tickets months and months in advance. And that was a really great time because I got to spend, a vast amount of time in Fenway Park and really enjoyed it. And I'm not a Red Sox fan. I just enjoyed old ballparks. Even when I was a kid, I would draw baseball fields and draw ballparks. It was just something that I always found fascinating.
Now, while you were here in Boston, you worked for the Boston Public Library. How did that help you in learning to research and doing the kind of research that you do? And I'd like to, we explained it last time on the Bambino, but this is very important on how you do your research. And we spoke.
Yeah, well, while I was at the BPL, I stumbled across a story, which was the suicide of Red Sox manager Chick Stahl during spring training in 1907. And the book, I'd read in a book that he died because of the pressures of managing. And I've told this story a lot, but I thought, well, if that's the case, there should be a whole cemetery of Red Sox managers. And I got intrigued, why did he actually kill himself? And in researching that led me to the Boston newspapers on microfilm, of which the library had a vast collection. And I kind of fell in love with ferreting out stories from those old newspapers. And at the time, Boston sported nearly a dozen daily newspapers. So I discovered while doing that very first story, which was the very first story I wrote and sold, that if you went to a variety of newspapers, you got more of a story than had appeared before. And that was kind of the key for me, which unlocked the historical process. And that's the approach I've taken ever since, is I don't just go to the obvious sources, books that have been written before. I try to go as much as possible to the original sources, which in many instances, when you're writing about, baseball of the dead ball era, or even, these days into the 1940s and 50s, since there are fewer and fewer people still alive who played, is you have to go back to the newspaper reporting, and you have to go back to all of the newspaper reporting, not just those newspapers that are easy to get to. The Boston Globe is available online, but, there was the Boston Post, the Boston American, the Boston Traveler, the Boston Transcript, all these different papers that if you take those accounts, cumulatively, you get a much richer portrait of what took place than you ever would with any single source. And I didn't know it at the time, but I've since learned that very, very few people take that approach. I'm one of very, very few. And that's why, I tell people, well, essentially, I've just been doing the same kind of research for 30 years. I don't see many other people doing that depth of research that I do. And that's enabled me to continue to find stories and to continue to write books that haven't appeared elsewhere. It's not magic. It's just, it's just hard work.
And let me ask you this. Your research is beautifully done. And you know what's really exciting about this is that you even get the coordinations and the concrete and the way that the field is designed. But let me ask you this question, because I didn't know this until I read your book. There was a specific reason why Fenway was built. The current owner wanted to sell the team, and he felt with a bigger ballpark and a more architecturally designed one, he'd be able to sell the team easier.
Right. It would be more valuable because at that time period, having a wooden ballpark, which is what the Huntington Avenue grounds was a liability because they were starting to burn down, and insurance was getting really, really expensive. And, he had another ulterior motive. That's John I. Taylor of the Boston Globe Tailors, who was the owner of the team. And that was also because they owned a lot of land in the Fenway section of Boston, which was a relatively recently recovered area of Boston that had been very swampy, but had been drained, and now it was ready to develop. But it didn't have any identity. So by putting a ballpark there and calling it Fenway Park, referring to the neighborhood, it suddenly made real estate in that area much more attractive. It was a defined area now. So, they talk about ballparks being built today, trying to stimulate economic growth. Well, that's what Taylor was doing. It wasn't done as a public works project like some of today's stadiums are. It was done to enhance his own real estate holdings.
And let me ask you this. This is how in-depth you get. And I was going to ask it before the show, but I found out a little bit, talking to you before, the groundskeeper, Jerome Kelly, played a major part of, the construction of the infield and the field at Fenway Park.
Well, it's just my favorite part of the book in many ways, because I think it's just such a fabulous picture. But I found a clipping that actually was, I think, from in February 1912, and it was just a couple of paragraphs that made note of the fact that the infield turf had been taken from the Huntington Avenue grounds at the end of the 1911 season and transferred and planted in the infield at Fenway Park. And I thought, well, this is just a wonderful, visual image of that. And then later I found some very scratchy newspaper photographs where you could actually see that the infield grass had been put in place on the plot of land where Fenway was built, then fenced off when this was still just raw, undeveloped land, and the ballpark had been built around it because they knew they had to get the grass in that fall so it would have a chance to take root in the infield so that by the time they opened play in April, the grass would be rooted. So I just thought it was just a wonderful image of a ballpark being built around the infield grass. The infield grass was the first thing put down. Now, of course, if you're building a ballpark, if you go to a ballpark a week before it's built, there's no grass in it yet. That's the very last thing they put down because of all the irrigation and substrate they put in and everything like that. But that just illustrated for me dramatically how different the time was. It allowed me to introduce the neighborhood. It allowed me to introduce the time. As we explained before we started recording, I went back and I researched everything I could about Jerome Kelly, his genealogy, his family history, the history of that neighborhood. I looked at photographs of the ballpark and the surrounding buildings, so I was able to recreate that trip of cutting the turf up, loading it onto horse carts, taking it over to Fenway Park, and putting it back down. And that's how the book begins. It's a prologue. And I did that because I wanted to evoke the time, and I wanted to create a visual scene for the reader so you could start to imagine this place before it existed, because Fenway Park, as it was originally built when it opened in April of 1912, looks nothing like the ballpark you see today. Everybody talks about, oh, isn't it wonderful, Fenway's been preserved, it's such a fabulous place today, all that stuff. It's a terrific place, but it's not anything like it was when it was first built and opened in April of 1912. It was a radically different place. And I think that's important because, you know, it's important to realize that Fenway has not been preserved under glass. But from the very beginning, it has been allowed to evolve. And what you see at Fenway Park today is the result of that evolution. It is not an antique that's been preserved the way it was originally built.
And you know, so we're going to go into design about it, which takes up probably the first quarter of your book. But even before that, didn't they take some wood from the Huntington Avenue grounds and build like the bleachers out in right field?
I think they probably used some of the wood from there, but you know, Fenway was a concrete and steel stadium, but only a portion of it when it was first built. They still used wood to build the center field bleachers. That's how it was done then. So, you know, it was this kind of hybrid at the time. Yes, it was concrete and steel, but partially due to the fact they didn't want to spend a lot of money, partially due to the fact that it had to be done so quickly. You know, they didn't build the entire park out of concrete and steel. There were still wooden elements to it, and over the course of the 1912 season, additional wooden elements were added that gave Fenway the now familiar footprint that it has today. That footprint of Fenway that's so unique and so remarkable today did not really come about as had been so often described because the streets around it and the strange plot of land. You have to realize that at the time, that plot of land was plenty big for a ballpark because this was the dead ball era, and no one ever conceived that someone might hit the ball over the left field wall. That was thought to be impossible. It has that funny shape because they just used all the land they had to get as many seats in as possible eventually. That's why it has a funny shape. If they would have wanted it to be symmetrical, they easily could have done that. That this wasn't a consideration then. You know, fences and ballparks were not to provide a target for home runs. Fences were there just to keep the fans off the field.
That's right, because the dead ball era, again, how are you going to hit something that's like mush, like a head of cabbage, and go over the fence?
And they liked having expansive outfields so they could get overflow crowds and stand them in the outfield for those holiday games and those weekend games, and sometimes in the World Series where they would have so many more fans that wanted to get in than at other times. It was like, yeah, have a big outfield. If we have an extra 100 feet in center field, so what? We can pack that with people. And that's what they would do.
And when the team was sold, they sold it, and I think General Taylor bought it, if I'm not mistaken. He bought up 365,000 feet of land in a section where nothing was really going on in the Kenmore section.
Right. There was no, you know, the Buckminster Hotel, which is, of course, where later the 1919 or the Black Sox scandal was first plotted and planned. That was the westernmost hotel in Boston. And the Fenway district, the Fenway area, was raw, undeveloped land that had kind of recently been reclaimed and drained. And they had to, you know, they had to make it flat. I mean, there was nothing there. A scraggly few trees. It had sort of been used as, people had dumped all sorts of debris in there. It was just raw, undeveloped land.
And let me ask you this just blows my mind being an attorney. When they did break ground, I think it was September 25th, 1911, if dates come into my mind, they didn't even have a building permit. The team didn't even have a permit. How'd they get around?
Well, that's
what the hell's going on here?
But when you're, when you're rich and powerful, sometimes those things don't matter.
What's going on?
Sometimes those things don't matter when you're rich and powerful. That's all worked out after the fact, Let's just say there probably weren't the safety regulations that are in place today when you were building back then. So I don't think they were much concerned about that. There was no community opposition because there was no community out there.
And there would be no opposition when you think it was, like you said, they were draining the swamps and the marshland and stuff. But now let me ask you this: they tapped architect James McLaughlin. He designed other parks at the time. His company did, if I'm not mistaken.
No, he didn't. That's the only ballpark he designed.
Really?
McLaughlin never designed another ballpark. Osborne Engineering later did the renovation in 1934, and they did a lot of ballparks back then. But McLaughlin was previous to that, and he's still a bit of a mystery because he had no heirs, so there's very little known about him. What there is known about him, believe me, is in the book because I looked at him very, very closely. But, he was an architect, and up until that point, he had primarily built schools and armories. And you can actually see that in Fenway because the Fenway offices on Yawkey Way, or what was then Jersey Street, the Fenway offices have a brick facade. And it's in this craftsman style of design known as tapestry. And if you look at McLaughlin's other buildings around Boston, and I did, you see hints of Fenway Park in the brickwork.
Yeah, I saw it last week when I was there. And,
yeah. Now, one of the interesting things is that appear in this book are the only architectural renderings that date back to 1912 of the construction of the ballpark. The only ones that exist. And this is just a great research story because I really didn't know how the park was built, and I really wanted to know that. I didn't know the construction aspect of it. When I was much younger, worked construction quite a bit, concrete and steel work, so I was familiar with some of the processes, and you can look up some of the historical processes. But without some architectural renderings, it was really unclear. And no one, the city doesn't have the original plans or anything like that. I'd never seen them reprinted. And one day I went on an extraordinarily long excursion into the Internet, just trying every possible combination of Boston baseball fields, Fenway, just trying to find, had anything been written at that time about Fenway Park. And I finally searched Boston baseball plant because at the time, baseball ballparks were often referred to as baseball plants because they were like factories. They were places where people worked at baseball. And in Google search under books, I found an obscure reference in an index of engineering journals dating back to 1913 that it was just one line, and it referred to an article in a magazine called, Boston's Baseball Plant or something like that. And I'd worked at the Boston Public Library, as you know, and I knew we had that journal because one of the things I did was I moved a lot of old stuff there when I was there. And I called up a friend of mine who worked at the BPL at the time, and I called him up. I gave him the reference. I said, if you have time, go find this for me and fax it to me. And it ended up being about a 4 or 6 page article in Engineering News, which was the gold standard of engineering magazines at that time. And lo and behold, reproduced in there were some architectural renderings of the park and also a very detailed description of the construction process and all that stuff. And when that fax came through about 20 minutes later, I was ecstatic because I knew that that was like a fulcrum that I could get into a whole area of Fenway history that had never been touched. And it does have an impact on why the ballpark still exists. All that stuff matters. It explains an awful lot about Fenway Park, and it came from, and literally that was about 8 hours I spent one day just looking on the internet before I found that single-lined reference in Google Books in an index of engineering journals that referenced a story that I thought could be about Fenway Park. And lo and behold, it was.
Oh, it's fantastic. Well, let me ask you this question. In a previous interview, you mentioned that because you did work in construction, it helped, understand, what was going on. But you also said if you lived back in 1911, 12, you would have wanted to be on the Fenway project.
Sure. I mean, it was steady work for the winter back then when a lot of construction projects were shut down. And it was a very harsh winter that year. So there wasn't a whole lot of work there. But, if you were a laborer back then, that was steady work for the winter at a time when there probably wasn't a whole lot of other work.
Now, you know what's interesting? I mean, let's face it. These guys didn't have the trucks that we had to move cement and stuff like that.
Sure.
In the rolling. How did these things prevent from freezing up? I remember reading in your book, I think it was the last day of the summer, a major blizzard hit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you'd pour concrete back then, and you would cover it with straw, and you'd tarp it. And in some instances, when it was really cold, you would use what were called salamanders, which were essentially you'd blow hot air underneath it. You'd have essentially a gas or steam engine that would create hot air and would blow hot air underneath it. And in fact, in 1934, during the Reconstruction, they were doing that, and a fire broke out because the salamander is very dangerous to use, particularly back then. And essentially, they still use the same processes today when you're pouring concrete in the winter. There's things you can do to the mix to make it set up better during colder weather, but you have to keep it from freezing. It generates heat itself. The chemical processes of concrete curing generates heat itself, but you have to prevent the moisture content from freezing until it's completely set. So, you pour concrete, you cover it with tarp and straw, and another tarp, and you blow hot air into it for a period of time until the concrete cures.
Wow.
And that's what they had to do, and they had to build it in sections, and, there were no cranes. You had to use this tripod system, essentially, where you could swing buckets of concrete, and then men with rakes, very physically demanding work, and believe me, I raked a lot of concrete in my life, and men with rakes who would then pull the concrete to the proper area, and there's all this massive formwork underneath it to support it that then would be taken out. There was a steel structure, but you still needed massive amounts of wooden formwork to support the stand area. And you can go underneath Fenway now. I think it's been painted. It's harder to see now, but when I was younger, I used to do some stuff for Nesson, and to go between Nesson and Fenway Park, you would go to parts of the park where the public really couldn't see, where you'd be very, very close to the underside of the stands. You can still see the wood grain in the concrete.
Wow.
From those 1912 forms.
Wow. Now let me ask you this. Now that the ballpark is going up and all this stuff, What are Bostonians thinking? I mean, it is in a secluded section of Boston. How are they going to get there? Streetcar, horses, walking? I mean, what was going on in the builder's mind?
Well, I mean, there were streetcars that ran into Kenmore Square, which is then known as Governor Square. So access was reasonable. There was actually originally a small parking lot. Probably didn't fit 40 or 50 cars, but it was one of the first ballparks that actually had parking. But it was accessible. You would still have to, even like today, you take the T into Kenmore Square, and then you have about a 5 or 10 minute walk to the park. And that's much how it was then, but that was, understood then because people were accustomed to, taking public transportation to near where they worked and walking there. So it wasn't really an impediment, to anyone, even though it was at this kind of the western edge of Boston. Boston's still so small that, from downtown you could walk there in about half an hour. It's not that far. So it wasn't so remote. I mean, had they built it in Roxbury or something, which was then considered the hinterlands, that would have been like, oh my gosh, that's way too far away. But it was still close enough. And people don't realize today, too, quite frankly, how close it was to the old Huntington Avenue grounds and the Braves ballpark that was right across the street, right across the train tracks. Essentially, it was just right across the Fens, which is the swampy area that still exists today. It was just right across there. So, Boston had kind of been around that area, just not in that area itself. So it was accessible from a couple directions.
Let me ask you this. When, the ballpark was being built, the change of ownership happened. And, of course, they wanted to make some return on investments immediately. What did they do that was much different than the design of where people sit, like in the Huntington grounds over there, to literally put more people in the stands at Fenway?
Well, one of the things they did in the grandstand was the pitch of the stands is not constant. The higher up you go in the grandstands, the pitch of the stands increases. This made it easier to get seats closer to the field, which is beneficial today, because that's one of the great things about Fenway Park. Yes, you have posts, but you're very, very close to the field, as opposed to some of these cantilevered newer ballparks that look like old ballparks, but you're way farther away from the field. But the way they did the pitch of the grandstand, it's bowed a little bit. So the higher up you get, it's a little steeper, so that enables you to look over the heads of the people in front of you. The closer you are to the field, it's not pitched as steeply. Well, you're much closer to the field. But as you get farther up, it's steeper, so you can see over the tops of people's heads better and look down on the field. Braves Field, for instance, which was built just a couple of years later, that was one of the big problems with Braves Field, is that it was pitched not very steeply, and it was built at a constant pitch. There were never good sight lines at Braves Field. You were always looking at the person in front of you because you were only a few inches higher than them. And, in fact, to try to help that, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, they actually lowered the field itself by a couple of feet to put the field down lower to help out so you could actually see over and see into it better. But that's one of the reasons I think that in the long term, Fenway survived, because you do get, even though it's cramped today and there are posts, you do have a really good view of the field. And even though people are bigger today, you can still see over the person in front of you when you're up at the upper reaches of the grandstand. And we're talking the original grandstand, which was the original concrete and steel structure that began and ended not very far past first base and not very far past third base. The extensions that go down the first base line towards right field and the third base line all the way to the wall did not exist in the original construction.
Why do you think that, Fenway Park, just like, Wrigley Field, which was built, I think, 2 years later, in 1914, I believe it was put up, Wrigley Field. Why do you think those two ballparks withstood the test of time? And by what I mean is, in the 19th, they had those round, they all looked alike, Veterans Stadium and Riverfront and Three Rivers Stadium. And I know they wanted to do something like that in Boston.
Right. Well, in Boston, it was because the intersection of sports and politics in Boston has never been smooth, and there were any number of ballpark plans proposed beginning in the 1950s to replace Fenway. It had been reconstructed and updated in 1934, which was very important. So as a structure, it was still sound. But a lot of people wanted to build suburban parks. I'm working on a thing on the Patriots now, and there were people that wanted to build combination football, baseball stadiums. And the Red Sox always deferred from that, even though initially because Tom Yawkey, who owned the team, one of the things he liked to do when the team was out of town was to work out in Fenway Park. He and his wife would picnic in the outfield, run a radio with extension cords, and listen to games while he's picnicking. He's a fabulously wealthy guy. He liked having his personal private playground. So some of it was just stubbornness on his part. He got frustrated in the 1960s because there wasn't enough parking. And quite frankly, the 1967 Impossible Dream season, of which this is the 50th anniversary, that helped save Fenway Park because that introduced Fenway Park to a whole new generation of fans, a generation of young people. There were games in 1965 where Fenway drew fewer than 1,000 people. But the excitement of the 1967 season, and remember that was also the summer of love, young people were flocking to Boston. They discovered the Red Sox. They discovered Fenway Park, started to fall in love with it. And then the second big factor was the 1975 World Series, classic World Series between the Reds and the Red Sox. And on television, the contrast between Fenway Park and Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati was dramatic. And that introduced Fenway to the nation. You saw this unique, colorful, fascinating place. Riverfront Stadium looked like any other place, looked like 10 other stadiums in baseball. And you had a classic World Series that played out on this unique field, and that introduced Fenway to baseball fans everywhere. And from that time forward, when you came to Boston, Fenway Park was a destination, a place you wanted to see. And so from 75 onward, it became really untenable to tear it down and build a new ballpark. People took ownership of it, and it came to represent something quintessentially Boston.
And when you think about the 75 series, and it just dawned on me, because I had Herb Creen on my show. He just wrote the 15th.
Yes, I know Herb.
Yeah. He's a really nice guy. He wanted me to go to the SABR meeting down in Pawtucket, and it was canceled to the 17th of June. Really nice guy. We talked about the immaculate, the season of,
The Impossible Dream?
The Impossible Dream, not the Immaculate Dream. I'm thinking of it's too early in the morning. Man, not for me. I wake up about 3:30. Half the day's gone for me. Let me ask you this question, though. It just dawned on me. I mean, when you think about it, Riverfront Stadium was turf, and Fenway was grass. You had two different games. You had that turf, which was a quicker way of playing, which the Reds had mastered, and you also had the Green Monster in left field, which, again, Carl Yastrzemski, more than anyone else, was a master of playing the ball off the wall.
Yeah. I mean, it was just the contrasts were as dramatic as they could possibly be. And, it's I think at that point, too, where people started to see that these cookie-cutter stadiums weren't good for the game. They didn't provide a great backdrop for the game. The game was simply more interesting being played at these older ballparks, and of course by then many of them were already gone. Forbes Field was gone, Crosley Field was gone, Connie Mack Stadium in Philadelphia was gone, and then somebody looked. It's like everybody looked around and said, "My gosh, there's only a handful of these left." You had Comiskey, you had Wrigley, you had Fenway, you had Tiger Stadium, Yankee Stadium, which was somewhat different, but there were still a handful of classic places, and they finally began to be appreciated. It also helped Fenway that it was, in the neighborhood it was in, the surrounding neighborhood didn't deteriorate in some ways that neighborhoods in other cities had. It was closer to downtown. It wasn't, because of the Fens area, which was so nearby, it wasn't like being pressed on by other developments, because that's parkland and difficult to build on and so on and so forth. So, there's a number of factors, but they all combine and then, just add the fact that, at the intersection of sports and politics in Boston, to build a stadium, 100 fools would rush in, each thinking they were going to get rich. I mean, Frank McCourt, who later owned the Dodgers, was able to parlay a piece of land for a potential park into ownership of the Dodgers. And city and state government in Massachusetts, as opposed to other places, never fell for the trick, at least in regard to ballparks. They never fell for the trick that they should build it. Tom Yawkey had a lot of money. People were like, well, if Tom Yawkey wants a new ballpark, Tom Yawkey should build it.
And this was built without public funds.
Right, it was built without public funds. Yawkey, was a gazillionaire. He had plenty of money. He was very tight with it, but he didn't want to lose, ownership of it. I mean, at times they were able to finagle things from the city in terms of some parking and basic infrastructure that was helpful for them, but it was a private facility.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, the whole aura of Fenway Park. And let me ask you, how were folks getting ready for the new season? Because I know there was going to be a exhibition game between Harvard and Boston, and people really, they can't wait. My God, brand new ballpark.
Wait, could you repeat that, please?
Oh, you didn't hear me?
Yeah, I lost you there for a second.
That's all right. My wife loses me all the time, purposely, I think. But anyway, with the Bostonians, they're like, there's going to be an exhibition game, Harvard and the Red Sox, and what was the anticipation of Bostonians at that time?
Well, I mean, there was some anticipation for it because it was new and it was different. The weather was terrible for that first exhibition game. So, not that many people showed up. What I found fascinating from that first exhibition game is that, and it only took the Red Sox as an organization almost another 100 years to figure this out, is that at that very first game, there are descriptions in the press of a number of young boys who scaled the left field wall and watched the game from atop the left field wall. Now, of course, the so-called green monster seats that are on top of the left field wall are among the most prized at the ballpark and didn't exist until the current ownership group, the additions that they've made over the last 15 years at Fenway Park. And the green monster seats were one of the first things they did. And people had been asking for years, why aren't there seats up there? And previous ownership groups said, oh, no, you can't do it, blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, you always could. The more recent ownership groups under the Yawkey Trust, they tried to convince everyone that Fenway Park was deteriorating and falling down and couldn't be fixed, which was a blatant lie because they wanted to get rich off of it. But I just found it fascinating that the very first game at Fenway Park, people looked at the left field wall, said that'd be a great place to watch a game, and they climbed up and they sat there.
That's a great story. Now,
and of course, the left field wall itself is actually just a retaining wall to keep Lansdowne Street behind it from tumbling into the ballpark. That's why it exists. Half of it's a retaining wall. The bottom half is sort of a retaining wall. The top half was so people couldn't look into the park from the buildings across the street. There was nothing aesthetic about it. It was purely utilitarian.
Now, let me ask you this. We didn't have that center field triangle. Instead, it was called Duffy's Cliff out there.
Well, you had Duffy's Cliff in left field, and that was that slope of earth. That was the part of the retaining wall. You needed that slope of earth to hold back Lansdowne Street. It served a second function because it was sloped well enough so for overflow crowds, you could actually stand on it and see over someone's head. And then for the 1912 World Series, which is where they added, 10,000 seats, wooden seats, which gave the ballpark its now familiar footprint, they actually put bleacher seats on Duffy's Cliff because it was pitched correctly and added seats there. So that set up this fascinating thing in the World Series there where you could if you hit a ball, it didn't happen, but it could have. In the 1912 World Series, if you hit a ball over the left field wall, what's now called the Green Monster, but had you hit a ball over the wall, it was a home run. But if you would have hit it over a smaller wall in front of Duffy's Cliff and into Duffy's Cliff, it would have been a ground rule double.
Wow.
Because they'd added seats and they had to put in this small barricade fence in front of Duffy's Cliff. They thought, well, that's even too short. So there's no other instance in Major League Baseball where you could have hit the ball out of the park into the stands for a double and over the wall behind it for a home run. But that was a special ground rule put into place for the World Series.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let me ask you this. Now that we spoke a little bit about the park, changes in ownership now changes in managership. Jake Stahl, he was a banker, and now he's a player manager. How did he impact the 1912 Sox?
Well, he was a change from the manager before. Stahl was kind of a no-nonsense guy. He was, had been a player himself, and a pretty decent player. But at that time, to some degree, the players were almost self-policing on their own. I don't think you did have guys like John McGraw who were much more, hands-on as managers. But at that time you also had guys that, the captains on the field often made a lot of the decision-making and things like that. Stahl was the right guy for that team. It was a younger team, flush with some talent. And, he let him play the game. And, he had Smokey Joe Wood. And, you have somebody who's having a year like he is. You just keep putting you just keep putting the ball in his hand every 4 days.
And and that's what I was going to get to, because the most prolific pitcher at the time, two of them I would say, was Walter Johnson and, of course, Crispy Mathewson. But how prolific was Smokey Joe this year?
Well, he had one of those, lightning in the bottle years. He'd been a good pitcher before, but he suddenly, put it all together. And he threw really hard. And, he had one of those years where he was almost unbeatable, and was as good as anybody has ever been. That's he was 34-5 that year.
Was.
That's remarkable. For a guy his size, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he threw very, very hard. And, you ride that horse as long as you could. It may have played a role in the fact that his career was sort of cut short after that, although there are other reasons for that. He took a fall, and, if you look at it today, it's pretty clear that he ended up with a rotator cuff tear, and that cost him his pitching career. But, for one season, it's, if you have the decision, if you want to take one pitcher for 1 year in all of baseball history, Joe Wood in 1912 is one of the people you have to talk about.
And let me ask you, he had a very close relationship with Tris Spica, who was on again.
Yeah, they did. They shared a house in, I think it was in Winthrop, which is just north of Boston on the water. And they were the two stars of the team, at the time too. So they were very close. And it's funny, at the time they would actually print in the newspaper the address of their house. So, they'd go after the game, and sometimes there'd be some company waiting for them. Not all of it young boys looking for autographed baseballs either.
Yeah, I bet. The women, and that reminds me of something I did miss. Yeah, hot springs, man. It's like today, spring training. Yeah, it's a rite of spring, and everyone has to, come in shape. But back then, it was like a merry-go-round in Hot Springs.
Yeah. Hot Springs, Arkansas was one of the most notorious towns in North America. There was open gambling, there were brothels, there were horse race tracks, there were hot springs, and one of the reasons a number of baseball teams, including the Red Sox, trained there is that, you had to do something to entice these guys to come to spring training. They weren't getting paid when they were at spring training. But if you had spring training in a place like Hot Springs, players were a lot more eager to go and to go early.
Yeah.
And yes, they put their time in on the field, a couple of hours, and then you might go for a hike in the surrounding hills. But there was plenty for the players to do when they weren't playing baseball. And that was very, very important. I mean, that's, one of the reasons that spring training started to drift south, because in the early days, like, for instance, the Red Sox, for a time, they held spring training in West Baden, Indiana, which isn't very far south. The weather was terrible. So they started moving south, A, for better weather, and B, because better weather enticed these guys to actually get to spring training a little earlier. And if they had the opportunity to gamble or find a little company or have some nightlife while they were down there, well, they were more likely to come early.
Now, here's something I learned in your book. When Smokey Joe got to spring training, him and Stahl ran, had a run-in. And what was that all about?
Yeah, well, they had the run-in. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to remember, but I think it had to do with the drills for covering bases.
Yeah,
is that right?
Smokey was looking sluggish and like
Yeah, it's the spring training right where you drill the pitchers in spring training for covering first base and all this, and Wood was kind of like, I don't need to do that, but he'd been a stubborn pitcher before, and he kind of got over himself a little bit during that year, and I think Stahl had something to do with that, is kind of challenging him, like, yeah, you've struck out all these guys, but you're not winning like you should, and it's about time for you to get it together, and so it was a maturity thing. Wood was very, very young. I don't know, 25, 26 years old at the time. So
I think it was 22, I think.
Yeah, maybe even younger than, he was still very, very, very young, and, had gotten to a point where he was kind of, almost satisfied with himself, but he could have been much better, and I think that point was made to him that year. It's like, you can't set your own rules. You have to get on the program with everybody else, and that includes, by the way, covering first base and all that stuff, and holding on runners, which he hadn't been much interested in. He'd sometimes pitch from the full windup with guys on first base.
And what's beautiful, and when you read a book like this, you start out with the whole building of Fenway Park, and then you go into the season, and then you see how the park almost like comes semicircular back to itself as you complete the book. And one of the things that stood out was the Red Sox fans and what was going on in the bleachers, what was going on at Michael Nuff McGreevy's.
Nuff said McGreevy, yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is great stuff because it's all part of that Fenway persona at the time. Let's discuss this.
Right. I mean, you had an organized fan group that had been at the Huntington Avenue grounds known as the Royal Rooters, and their base of operations was a bar near the ballpark called Third Base because it was, quote unquote, the last stop before home. It was known as McGreevy's. It was owned by a guy named Nuffsaid McGreevy, and he was head of a group called the Royal Rooters. And when they played at the Huntington Avenue grounds, they'd kind of have a parade to the ballpark. And when the Red Sox moved to the Fenway, well, they moved their allegiance over to the Red Sox. And you know, in the 1912 World Series, they actually played a role in the in the series because they felt their seats had been sold out from under them. And so, you know, at one point they kind of take over the field in a sense, and they get into fights with other fans in the outfield, and they end up knocking over this temporary fence, and it's, you know, they really had ownership. You know, they felt they were very, very important. They really felt ownership towards it. And then in what was known as the right field pavilion, you also had a contingent of fans. That's where all the gamblers were. And, you know, those were the people that were in the park day in and day out. You know, back then you usually only had big crowds on weekend days because the regular working man couldn't get to the ballpark. He was working. Games started at 3 o'clock, so you could get some of them. But weekday crowds would be pretty small. Well, they depended on those 400 or 500 gamblers who would be in the stands every day. That was an important source of revenue for them. And the type of gambling that was done, and I've actually seen this at Fenway Park in my early days there, was the type of gambling where you're gambling on every pitch. Ball or a strike, you know, fly ball or ground ball. They were called do me or don't they bets. And these guys would keep a running tally. You know, you'd call out what you wanted to bet for, and somebody say, I'll put 5 on that. And they'd all do a running tally throughout the game and then settle up afterwards. It's not that they were betting so much on who would win, but the outcome of individual pitches, the outcome of individual at-bats, things of that nature.
And some of these bets, as you mentioned in your book, got up to $50,000.
Oh, when they were betting on the outcomes of the World Series, yes. Then you would have substantial betting being done. And openly reported in the newspapers, it did not have gambling in baseball at that time did not have the moral tinge that it has today. Back then, it was part and parcel to the game. The game needed it. The game fostered it. The game supported it. When it served their purpose, they would occasionally react in horror. You know, they'd be Claude Rains in Casablanca. They'd be absolutely shocked. But at the same time, that was all with a nod and a wink. Everybody knew that gambling took place. You know, they couldn't stop it. They really didn't want to stop it because had they done so, they'd have lost a substantial portion of their crowd.
And you know, some of these Royal Rooters that we're so talking about here, they actually followed the team down during spring training to hot springs.
Oh yeah, they go down to spring training. Nuffsaid McGreevy at one point was signed to a spurious contract by the Red Sox and was allowed to work out with the club. You know, given his own uniform, and they would the Royal Rooters as a group, they would not just follow the Red Sox, but when World Series time came. For about a 20-year period, they started out as fans of the National League team back in the 1890s, and then sort of transferred their allegiance to the Red Sox when the Red Sox came into being. But they would go to the World Series every year, and would, no matter who was playing, and they would bring a band with them, and they would parade from their hotel to the ballpark, and they were known by baseball fans in every major league city in the country. The Royal Rooters were the foremost baseball fan group in the country. And, of course, McGreevy's, you could also argue, was one of the first sports bars in the country because it was decorated in baseball photographs and baseball paraphernalia. And they were a huge part of everything. And they acted more like a soccer crowd than what we think of as a baseball crowd today. They would chant. They would beat drums. They would sing songs. Of course, that's the tradition they brought from Ireland. And the gambling tradition was brought over from Ireland, too. And they just adapted to baseball, adapted to the game that was in front of them.
And let me ask you this, because this is, this is a great thing that's going on. You know, you have these fans, you have this rabid desire. You have gambling. You have the opponents in the World Series, which we'll get to in a second, with John McGraw, who was a known gambler, who owned gambling places
Sure.
In Cuba and stuff. In your opinion, and I know not everything is documented, but I'm sure if we did deep-sea research or in the research that you've done, don't you think that every major World Series played up until around 1919 and after when Landis came aboard was somehow tainted, whether it's a game?
I do, and I think, tainted is probably the right word, but I don't think they were fixed, and I think there's a difference. Because, and here's the difference, I don't think they tried to change the final outcome, but I do think to provide extra financial opportunities for the players, that they would arrange games during the World Series, and it would sort of be on the order of, you guys can win this one, we'll win the next one. We all know what's going on here. You guys can make your bets so you can win on game 2. We'll make our bets so we can win on game 3. And, and that balances off, right? And then we play the rest of it straight.
Yeah.
Sort of like in the early days of professional wrestling, they would usually be 3 fall matches. And the first 2 would usually be arranged, and then the third one would be played straight. That's the kind of thing they were doing.
And of course, boxing and baseball, that's pretty much what it was for the early
sure.
years. I mean, and it's the gambler's paradise. You could.
And it was easily done because you do have the incident in the 1912 series where Joe Wood is just knocked all over the lot, and his brother punches somebody out. Punches another pitcher out, allegedly because, of the way he pitched. And, and this is openly reported at the time. And not with, banner headlines as oh, my God, it's just, oh, yeah, and by the way. And so, but like I say, yes, they were tainted, but I don't think they were fixed. I don't think that the final outcomes were determined. But it served them in some instances to make sure extra games were played because that gave them access to extra money because you'd have more fans in, a higher take. And then in some instances, games were arranged because if the game was arranged, you could make a side bet and you could add to your take. You have to understand that, at this time period, the average life expectancy was only 50 years old. And these guys had very short careers. You only had a small amount of time to make any money. There were no guarantees that after baseball you were going to, A, live a long time, or B, have the opportunity to make that much money doing anything else. So, take it while you can. Get it while you can. And it's not like management was making it easy for you. If you got hurt, you got cut. See ya. So you had to take care of yourself, you had to take care of your family. And, if you're coming from a tradition where that's kind of accepted, like I said, I don't assign a moral stain to the fact that gambling was going on and sometimes affecting outcomes of games.
Well, I
think only rarely did they affect, outcomes of a World Series or, who made it into the World Series and things like that.
I mean, and you're absolutely right. Now, this is the interesting thing. Ed Roush, who played for the Cincinnati Reds of 1919, after the Landis decision came down, and then we got to remember here, after a court of law exonerated all these folks, including the gamblers, Rothstein and his henchmen and everyone down the line, Ed Roush said, hey, they weren't doing anything that we usually don't do. This is just common knowledge. But yet Landis knew that just like us talking so casually about, well, yeah, gambling, that's part of it. He was going to make a lesson out of this. He says, to hell with this. Nothing's going to taint the game. And
Yeah.
God.
Well, they had to distance themselves from a lot of their past because, here's something that really did taint the game, and that was syndicate baseball. And syndicate baseball was where one man could own portions of several teams. Van Johnson, as president of the American League, had a piece of a number of teams in the league. Van Johnson, as American League president, would sometimes arrange trades. He would sometimes arrange ownership shifts. And many of the times those changes were made for his financial benefit. So if you own a piece of two different teams or three different teams and you're arranging trades to benefit one over the other, well, and that you're really affecting the outcome then.
Yeah.
But they didn't want the scrutiny on that. Okay, so let's blame the players.
That's right.
I mean, then as now, ownership still has the hammer.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you're absolutely right.
I mean, even though players are making millions of dollars today, I mean, ownership still has the hammer in many regards.
Now, let me ask you this in the World Series. I mean, it goes to 8 games only because there's a 6-6 tie.
Right, right.
Let's go into the 6-6 tie, and let's go into a little bit about the seesawing backwards and forwards between Johnny McGraw, who's a legend in New York, and Stahl and the Red Sox.
Yeah, well, you had a World Series between two teams that were, there were two classic teams. They each had, big stars. I mean, you had Christy Mathewson for the New York Giants, who was, clearly the best pitcher in baseball at that time. He and Walter Johnson were the gold standard for that season. Joe Wood was their equivalent. But, Christy Mathewson was the guy that everybody talked about, everybody raved about. You had John McGraw, who was thought to be the best game manager in baseball. He was bigger in many ways than many of the players were. The Giants didn't have a batting star. They had Matheson, but the big star was John McGraw. So you had these great contrasts between, Matheson and McGraw, the old guard, and the Giants, one of the mighty, the mighty dynasties of the time, and the Red Sox, who were a much younger team that, they were kind of the upstarts. And then you still had, even then, you had a natural New York-Boston rivalry. They were the dominant cities of the Eastern Seaboard. Boston was considered the cultural center. New York was the financial center. So there were a lot of things at play during that World Series. And what's odd for me is you would think that, given that they all knew they were going to be in the World Series, that, say, for instance, the Giants would have set up their rotation for Matheson to pitch in Game 1 against Wood, but they didn't. Jeff Tesreau had a good year. They started Tesreau in Game 1, even though they had plenty of time to set up their rotation. Back then, they didn't even think in those terms of setting up your rotation. It's like, well, this is just the order, and we'll just stick with it.
Wow. Now, let me ask you this, because this will be my final inquiry, because we had a great show, and I like the fact it went over an hour. I know you got things to do on the Patriots and stuff like that, but let me ask you this question. In your research, you documented Titanic, and you would think it would have a bigger impact on baseball because it began in April of 1912, but it didn't really have the kind of impact that was spoken over the years.
No, I mean, that's often brought up when people, talk about, Fenway Park opened the same day as the Titanic and all this stuff. It was a big deal. I mean, the Titanic was a big deal, and it did kind of push some of the coverage of the Red Sox and Fenway Park away, but it wasn't, the way news traveled then was a much different speed. And the full dimensions of the Titanic tragedy took several days to unfold. It wasn't instantaneous as it is today. It might be there might be some impact, at least to me as a researcher, because I was surprised at the time that when Fenway opened that there weren't more photographs of Fenway Park that appeared in the newspapers. That might have been, from my perspective, the biggest impact of the Titanic disaster, is that it might have squeezed coverage a little bit so that you just didn't have, you would have expected that perhaps there'd been a big panoramic shot or something like that, and there wasn't. But then again, they were baseball plants, factories. They weren't seen as these symbolic, Fenway Park was not the symbol it is today. It was just another place to play. The Huntington Avenue grounds had been built, 20 years before. It was just another place to play. They replaced another ballpark. And, someday Fenway Park would be replaced. So there wasn't kind of the built-in nostalgia for a place like Fenway that we would expect to see, or when you open a ballpark today, there's a special section in the newspaper and, it's all over the TV and everything. It was much more matter of fact. It was a place to play baseball. What's the big deal?
That's fantastic. Well, let me ask you this. I asked a lot of questions. Is there something you think I missed or something you want to say to the folks at home?
Well, I think the one thing that I think gets pointed out over the course of the book is, you really have to look at the stands that were built in advance of the 1912 World Series, because that's the first time that Fenway Park was enclosed, where the stands took on the footprint that they have today. That was purely accidental. It was done because the Red Sox went on almost a 2-week road trip, and while they were gone, they took the empty spaces between the various sections of the stands and they built wooden stands to connect them. And that created sort of the belly in right field where they connect up to the center field bleachers. That's why the stands that run from the end of the grandstand to the left field wall are at a different angle. All that stuff results from this work that was done not when Fenway Park was opened, but was done in the few weeks before the 1912 World Series because, hey, it's the World Series, we're going to need more seats. And then, fast forward to 1933-34 when Yawkey bought the team and decided to renovate Fenway Park, and pretty much without thinking, because it was comfortable at that point, that's how it had been for 20 years, they just duplicated that in concrete and steel and made what had been a temporary change, they made that permanent. Had they wanted to make Fenway Park symmetrical or more shapely or whatever, it could have easily been done. It wasn't a concern in 1912, and by 1934, well, why not keep it the way it is? It's what people are used to. It's not some part of some grand design to make it quirky. It's not because of the shape of the Boston streets were made by cows and all this nonsense you'll see. It was utilitarian. And, as I said, one of the biggest reasons Fenway Park still exists today is that it was never preserved as an antique. It was always allowed to change and evolve for various reasons. That allowed it to survive. The only time it's been kind of preserved is in the shape it is now. But even then, over the last 10 or 15 years, there's essentially the equivalent of a second deck has been added. Interesting that when Fenway Park was first built, they made sure the foundations were strong enough to support a second deck. Even though it didn't have one, they thought, well, maybe someday. Had that not been done, Fenway Park would not have survived, because you could not have done the renovation work that's taken place at Fenway over the last 10, 15 years. You couldn't have done that had those foundations not already been strong enough to support it. But only now has, I think, Fenway kind of reached a static point. There's no more evolution to take place with it. So the Fenway Park you're seeing now is the Fenway you're going to see until probably in another 20 to 40 years, they finally make the decision that the concrete is deteriorated enough and it's going to have to be taken down. But previous to then, it survived because it was flexible, it was utilitarian, and it was allowed to change and evolve. That's the nature of the game, and that's what saved Fenway Park.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now, let me ask you this, Glenn. Where can we find your book?
You can find it these days primarily online. It's available in paperback. It's I think the hardback edition is you might be able to find it at a used bookshop or through Al Libris, which is a used bookseller. But any bookstore in the country can order it in paperback. It's still pretty widely available. If you haven't read it and you think you know everything there is to know about Fenway Park, I think this book will disabuse you of that notion. And, you mentioned we were talking earlier the importance of a notes section in a book. And I get in the notes section of the book into some real nooks and crannies and side alleys about Fenway Park and Fenway history and the history of the Green Monster, where that phrase came from and when it was first used. Because, when I first came to Boston in the early 80s, and I tell people this, and they don't believe me, I say, you never heard it referred to as the Green Monster. It was the Wall. The Green Monster didn't really come into wide use until after the 1986 World Series. Previous to then, it was referred to as the Wall. It had only occasionally been called the Green Monster, but it was called the Wall. People don't believe me, but it's, as Casey Stengel said, you could look it up, and I did. And that's what I did throughout this book, is I actually looked things up.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I loved it. And, I'll hold the line. I'm going to end the show, and then I'll talk to you about 30 seconds. Folks, this was a great show. A little long, but you know what? I had a great time. I hope you had a great time on it, Glenn. It was fascinating talking with you on it. And, go out, get the book, educate yourself. This is what we do. This is what Glenn does. And this is why I have folks like him on the show, so that you folks at home understand the real facts and what really went on and how it all applies today. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Glenn Stout. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.